All right. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully, everyone's had a great 3 days at JNUC. I met Andy. Andy's our speaker this morning, Andy McPherson. I met him a couple days ago, actually, at a happy hour. And I remember talking about the session that he was going to have. I think he said something about having the longest title of any sessions at JNUC. And so I didn't know this, but I would actually I now get to be the person to read the longest title at JNUC. So without further ado, please welcome Andy McPherson to the stage with How to Win Security and Influence Auditors with a Compliance Baseline, or How I Learned How to Stop Worrying and Love Security Audits. Give it up for Andy.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I appreciate it. Certainly after the night after, or the morning after the JNUC party. Always appreciate anyone that is willing to show up. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about compliance and creating compliance baselines. So my name is Andy McPherson. I'm a principal engineer at Liberty Mutual Insurance. I've been there for the past 5 years. But I actually got my start managing Macs in high school, where I created a directed study program to manage my school's publications and video editing lab. So we had beautiful blue and white G3s, if you remember those, some Flower Power iMacs. But since then, I've continued to work with Macs and managing them in higher ed, government, and also enterprise environments. Speaking of enterprise environments, I work for Liberty Mutual Insurance. So we're a leading global insurance company that provides a wide range of insurance products and services for individuals, families, and businesses. So we've been around for over 100 years. And yeah, I love working there. And I apologize if you've probably seen all the ads. I wanted to bring the emu on stage, but Jamf has a really strict policy against bringing animals on stage. So I apologize that they couldn't make an appearance. So let's talk a little bit about why I'm here. If you would have asked me how I felt about compliance and audits a couple years ago, I would have told you that I hate them and they terrify me. But what I found over time, and which is we're going to talk a little bit about today, is there is a way to feel a little better about audits and by creating a compliance baseline. So that's kind of why I added the subtitle of this. And it maybe my love of Stanley Kubrick and Peter Sellers may force me to exaggerate a little bit. I don't really love audits, but I do like them more than I did just a couple years ago. And we're going to talk a little bit about why and kind of how that came about. And a lot of my passion and why I enjoy doing what I do as a Mac admin and Jamf admin is I like creating good user experiences for people. And there's been a lot of as you know, trying to secure environments. Those kind of seem like polar opposites. They are trying to create a good user experience and also trying to create a secure environment often really don't work very well together. But I found through creating a compliance baseline, there's a way that you can secure your devices and also still provide a really great user experience. And that's what we're going to talk a bit about today. So the first thing I want to chat about is just securing Macs in a Windows environment. So Liberty Mutual is a mostly Windows environment, and probably many of you here that work in large-scale enterprise environments, except for a very select few, you're mostly going to be a Windows shop. And there's certainly some challenges that many of you have gone through, and in terms of adding Macs to an environment and keeping them secure. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about what that's like for a lot of people in enterprise environments. And then also something I like to call the audit game. And really, I'm kind of using that analogy to kind of explain, how do you go from being audited to compliance? Because we all want to have compliant devices. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and also how to create a compliance baseline. So that's there's been a lot of this is very compliance-heavy JNUC this year. So a lot of exciting things announced, but right now we're going to kind of go through a little tutorial at the end to show you how you can actually build one yourself and have a compliance baseline and start auditing yourself. And it's a lot easier than you think. So securing Macs in a Windows environment. It is not easy. It's very challenging, and I'll talk about some of the reasons why. And for those of you that have started at the very beginning with adding Macs to a Windows environment, usually, whether or not you started off with Jamf, if you're a Mac admin, adding Macs to a Windows environment, it ends up being a lot of manual configuration because a lot of the established, security policies and procedures don't include Macs, or maybe they don't work with Macs, so you're having to do a lot of manual configuration. Maybe you've had to give your users a 10-page configuration guide, which is not a great user experience, but you really haven't had a chance to fully automate things. So things can get a little messy. You end up having the bad user experience, but also that results in a lot of configuration drift because you maybe started out one place and then things change because you're not using a lot of automation or the config profiles that you need. Also, if you've had the pleasure of adding Macs in a Windows environment, you may not have the most Mac-friendly cybersecurity professionals And hey, you know what? If you're in a Windows environment and you get hired to secure Windows devices, maybe macOS was not on your resume. There's a lot of instances where people you'll get that pushback from cybersecurity that, hey, you know what? Best way to secure our environment, just get rid of the Macs because I see those as a risk and that's the quickest way to eliminate them, which is never a great feeling. So then you also might have risks identified in your environment. So you say you've gotten past the whole, okay, we're going to keep our Macs in our environment, and then you're dealing with risks that come up. And sometimes these are risks that are specific to macOS. Sometimes they're just more broader risks that affect Windows as a platform as well. But the challenge is, if you're a Mac admin, and actually I meant to say this at the beginning, I'm not a cybersecurity professional. That is not my background. I've been managing Apple devices for a long time, but I am not someone from our cybersecurity team. So what happens a lot of the times is there are risks that might be identified, but they don't come with any solutions because they might have solutions for Windows, but they don't have solutions for macOS. So then you're kind of scrambling, trying to figure out how do I secure my devices based on some guidance that maybe existed for Windows, but it doesn't apply to my platform. So what do I do? And it really is not a great experience to be in. So kind of the next step for a lot of Mac admins in this situation is you just start kind of building out your security posture. And there's the usual obvious ones like file vault encryption. We all know disk encryption is good. You don't have to be a cybersecurity person to understand that that's what you want to have in your environment. There's also things like the macOS restrictions payload in Jamf. You go through and some of those might make sense. You click those, lock things down a little bit. And then you kind of move on to the next identified risk because there's always a new surprise. We all love to scramble after an audit or a risk is identified in your environment and you're kind of scrambling to figure out what you need to do to mitigate those risks. So you've built up your security posture over time. You add the usual things and start managing macOS updates, using ADE, app updates. Maybe you add a DLP solution, security agents, software restrictions. You keep building up all the elements that, controls that will secure your environment, which is awesome. It is great, and that's kind of what a lot of us will do is, you follow, guidance and best practices, and you end up with a ton of stuff that you're doing to secure your environment. But the problem is that this is not something that can easily be audited. It isn't really defined as security compliance, because if you're able to, I don't know if you've ever had the question of, okay, let's talk about your security configuration. Well, okay, well, it's this policy and that script and that configuration profile, and you're doing all the things that you feel like you need to do, but it's really hard to communicate that, outside of your team, and particularly, in an audit or other situation like that. So I like to call this, security a la carte. You've kind of picked from the menu of available options that are in Jamf or elsewhere, and you. All right. Okay, all right, we're back. Thank you. Okay, yes. I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so we're at security a la carte, right? So we've got our great options. We don't have really great documentation. We don't have a way of sharing our security configuration, which we want to be able to do. But the good news is, as you know, we've got our security configuration, and as you know, security never changes, right? So you're good. You can walk away now. You've got your security posture in macOS, and you're good. Oh, wait. There's always something new. And it feels like all the work you've done is just, poof, it's gone in a thing of smoke. So say there's new macOS features out that you're like scrambling. Do I turn these off? Do I turn them on? I don't really know. There might be new risks identified in an audit or elsewhere in your organization. And it kind of feels like you're constantly building up your security posture and then having it all torn down again. And then you start really rethinking your security posture. And I personally, this is where the whole how I learned to stop worrying piece comes in, is I worry a lot. I want to be doing the best for my users. I want to be doing best for the business and making sure our devices are secure as possible. And then there's always that feeling of, oh, there's something I missed. Is there something I missed? Is really something that keeps me up at night, or can. But you start wondering, why did it happen? What did I do wrong? And how do I fix it? And the good news is, what I wanted to talk about today is how you can fix it by creating a compliance baseline, something that you can feel really confident about, and knowing that you're following best practices, and something that you can update and then communicate really easily with internally and into your users as well. Which kind of leads us to something I like to call the audit game. So we all know the basic concept of an audit and compliance, right? Is you're trying to audit for compliance. Are your devices compliant? Are you doing the things that you say that you're doing? What makes things really difficult is if you don't have a documented compliance baseline, it makes it really difficult to play the audit game, because you don't know what the definition of compliance really is. So if you want to get there from the audit to knowing all your devices are compliant, you have to do a little work. And the first thing I want to do is just start with defining what a security audit is, because I think the terms security and audit or audit and compliance get thrown around a lot. And the truth is that they're pretty simple, but they do vary, depending on the context in your organization. But let's just start with a simple definition of a security audit, and this one's a bit of a mouthful. And it's the independent review and examination of a system's records and activities to determine the adequacy of system controls, ensure compliance with established security policies and procedures, detect breaches in security services, and recommend any changes that are indicated for countermeasures. And that's from NIST. So that is that's a mouthful. It's a lot to process there. I tried to memorize it and couldn't get quite through all of it. But there is an important chunk here, and this is something that I kind of learned, is like, okay, well, what are we really trying to do? Like, what is compliance? What is a security audit? And the purpose of it is to ensure compliance with established security policy and procedures. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. And you can break that down even further and ask yourself, what are your established security policies and procedures? Again, we don't want it to be the security a la carte. What we want to do is we want to have those documented so we have the rules of the audit game, right? So if you're going to be audited, you need to have the security policies and procedures to know whether or not your devices are compliant. So if we have the rules to the audit game, we have those established security policies and procedures, we should be good to know if our devices are compliant. However, as I mentioned before, this isn't really the documented security policies and procedures. It's security a la carte, and it's not something that is easily auditable. It's not something, as I mentioned, that can be shared easily and updated easily. So that's the thing, is you can't play the game if you don't know the rules. So you can talk security and you can talk compliance all day, but if you do not have a very clear documented compliance baseline, then you don't know what compliance is, essentially, in your environment, and it really needs to be defined. So we'll talk about how we get there. So one thing I want to mention is, macOS security policies. So say yes, we have security policies, and maybe a lot of organizations have them written in a wiki or elsewhere. And let's talk a little bit about where they commonly come from, and then we'll talk about where I think they should come from after this. But they come from a lot of established security frameworks, like NIST and CIS, and that's kind of where all this stuff comes from. So if you've ever worked with or gone through an audit, a security audit, or anything like that, like this is where it all comes from, right? These are the best practices that are cross-platform in Windows, macOS, Linux, and iOS, and that's awesome. So that's a great place to start. We also talked a bit about experience. So a lot of what you're doing to secure your Macs, just through trying to follow best practices, kind of dealing with risks in your environment, it gets built up through experience. Where it gets really tricky is when you get into the Windows security policies. And I think that trying to apply Windows security policies in many, many cases is like trying to play a game where the rules are written in a language you don't understand, and it's from the 1800s. It's not going to work for you. Because, as we know, everyone here knows, that Windows and macOS, very different operating systems. I mean, it seems obvious, but at the same time, if you're in an organization that's primarily Windows-focused, those security controls and security policies for Windows are kind of seen as the standard, and the goal, a lot of times, that you're tasked with is to just mirror whatever we do on Windows. But that doesn't always make sense. And sometimes it's literally impossible, and it adds a lot of extra work, and you might not even do the right thing. So how do we get there? So this is where I think that macOS security policies should come from. And again, the CIS and NIST, that's awesome, and that's always where a lot of the stuff starts. But then we get into things like the macOS Security Compliance Project, which I think many of you might be familiar with. If not, I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail, and which will kind of give you the guidance that you need and implementation tools. And then also your cybersecurity advocate. So having a cybersecurity advocate in your organization, like I mentioned, I am not a cybersecurity person, but everyone needs an advocate. Everyone needs someone that wants to help you secure your Macs. I mean, essentially, we're all, even though a lot of the times it feels like you're at odds, maybe with people in your cybersecurity department, you're all trying to do the same thing, but just from slightly different angles. And if you're fortunate to have an advocate, they're a great person to collaborate with. We'll talk a little bit about what their role is in this. So you add those three things together, so kind of the framework, some of the implementation stuff, and working with a cybersecurity advocate, you kind of get your macOS security policies. Because that's a huge piece of this, is that you're not trying to just push out whatever guidance there is there for security controls and things. You are trying to find something that's tailored for your organization. So you might have different regulatory controls. You might just have, your users might have different needs, but it's really important to take kind of best practices and then collaborate with someone, with a cybersecurity professional in your organization to create what you and your users and your business needs. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the CIS critical security controls, and I think it's important when looking at these resources, kind of just defining what they do and what they don't do. So CIS, Center for Internet Security, has best practices. They do have the benchmarks for macOS that will give you this PDF that will tell you what you can do to reach different standards for compliance benchmarks. And it's really the kind of best practices, and I found it really awesome to kind of learn. I started noticing trends where people would, we would get requests for different things, and then you look back, oh, it all goes to CIS. So then you can look at how that compares back to Windows controls, and a lot of them all go back to the same critical security controls from CIS. So a really great learning resource. And one thing to know is that it's guidance, not implementation. It's not, CIS is not telling you, do this in Jamf Pro, or and this is how you get a compliant device. It's more just kind of broader guidance and specific stuff to learn about and understand why the controls exist. And so yeah, what it isn't is it is not a tool to secure your macOS fleet. Again, it's not going to do what you need for you, but it is a great learning resource. It's also not your security policy. As I mentioned before, you don't want to just find a benchmark and just push it all out to your users because every organization is different and has different needs. So the macOS Security Compliance Project is really fantastic. For me, this was kind of where a lot of it started, where I was like, oh, like there actually is a way to take this stuff from CIS and push it out in your environment, and it's up to date, and it's fantastic. So it's really a fantastic, open source tool that's put together by a number of people at government agencies, third parties, and Jamf to really make it so much easier to secure your Mac. So, and I can't stress how important this has been to me, and a really great learning resource. The other thing it does is it does create the configurations and the documentation that you need. The documentation is probably like, obviously, actually having the configurations is important because you need to have them, but the documentation is fantastic. As I mentioned, you can certainly build security configurations in Jamf Pro, but it does not result in documentation that you can easily share, and that's one of definitely the macOS Security Compliance Project's biggest strengths. And it is a command line tool, so it's Python, and you edit configurations in YAML. But what it isn't is, again, your security policy. It is not actually defining what you should do for your environment. And that is where your cybersecurity advocate comes in. And I'm very grateful that I have one in my environment, and thank you, Craig, you're awesome. And what they really should be is someone that is able to help you balance user experience with safeguarding business operations. And it's very, very important that you find someone in your organization, if you don't have one, that can do that collaborative experience. Because when you're a Mac admin, again, you're trying to configure devices so people can do their work. And a lot of the time, cybersecurity doesn't seem like they're trying to help you do that at all. In fact, it seems like quite the opposite. But if you can find someone that you can have that relationship with, where you can really help balance those pieces, it's super helpful. And everyone deserves to have one. And the other piece is that they can really help you understand risk. I've really learned a lot in collaborating with people in cybersecurity to help me understand what the actual risks are. And the other piece is that there are certain risks in environments that your organization might be willing to accept. That's not my call. I'm not a cybersecurity person, but if you have someone you can work with, they might be able to look at certain things and help you decide that maybe that's not practical to address, or maybe it isn't needed, or maybe you have other tools in your environment that are not Jamf that also deal with certain risks. So really helpful to have that conversation. And then also, what risks are there to mitigate? So, we talked earlier about kind of building that security posture, but sometimes it's hard to know what are the most important ones to prioritize, and they can really help you with that. But at the same time, they aren't everything. So what they aren't is, they're not the person creating and deploying your configurations. So it's very important sometimes for you to advocate for yourself as a Mac or Jamf admin as to certain things might not be practical. That doesn't mean you won't do them, but I think it's really important sometimes to understand the effort, a level that's involved in pushing things out to your environment and how that might impact your users. And speaking of users, I don't know if most people have this experience, but typically cybersecurity people aren't handling support escalations like a lot of Mac admins are. So, you learn a lot, obviously, when you add new security controls. Not all of it is positive, but it is really important to advocate for your users and their experience, especially when you're talking about enhancing security in your environment. So we've added those things together, and now we have your macOS security policies put together. So you've kind of taken the guidance, you've built the configuration, talked to your cybersecurity advocate, so you have that. And it would look something like this. McPherson Industries is not real, but if anyone... Not yet. Yes, it's true. It could happen. It would probably be a hot sauce company if it was anything. and hopefully no one's buying the domain right now and is going to try and sell it to me for a markup. But anyways, just wanted to use that as an example. So this is kind of what the macOS Security Compliance Project will give you, and it's a really awesome PDF that'll go through all your baseline and all the controls and everything like that, and you can share it around in your organization, and it just feels really good. People ask you, like, what does your security configuration look like? And you can be like, oh yeah, this is our baseline right here, and you can read through it. So let's talk about how we actually build it. And so we'll go into a little bit about creating a compliance baseline that will give you that sweet-looking PDF, but also give you something that a compliance baseline that you can audit yourself and determine whether or not your devices are compliant. To build a compliance baseline, we'll want to use Jamf Compliance Editor, which we talked about before, and Jamf Pro. We'll want to continue engaging with our cybersecurity advocate, and also you'll want to have communication, because part of what I'm talking about today isn't just the nuts and bolts. Like, sure, you can read a tutorial and create an amazing security baseline and then push it out, and you make everyone in your organization angry at you and not necessarily provide the security that your organization needs. So we'll talk a little bit about why communication is absolutely critical to creating a good user experience and while you're trying to secure your devices. So you have all that together, and you have a more secure macOS environment, which is what we all want. So Jamf Compliance Editor itself, again, uses the kind of nuts and bolts, and under the hood is all the stuff from the macOS Security Compliance Project and the Center for Internet Security benchmarks, and it's super easy to use. So I got started with macOS Security Compliance Project first, and then the JCE came out. I think it was announced for last year at JNUC, and I really like it. I find it's really easy to use, and it's also really nice to be able to, if you are having a meeting with someone, or hopefully your cybersecurity advocate, it's a really easy UI to just go through different rules and talk about them. It's a good conversation starter before you actually start building your baseline. And you don't need any command line experience, which is nice. And the other piece of that, it integrates directly with Jamf Pro. So there's actually a upload to Jamf Pro button in there, which is awesome. So of course, when I put all this together, I did not know that Jamf would be announcing the new compliance benchmarks this time. But the good news is, though, is that this is something you can do today. And really, it's the process of deciding on your baseline and all that other stuff. That's honestly where the hard work is. I mean, between this and the new compliance benchmarks, that's the easy part. It's having the conversations and deciding what's right for your environment and is not going to prevent your users from doing their work and create a bad experience for them. That's the hard stuff. And you should, if you want to do this, get started on that now, because that's the tricky part. But we're still going to talk about JCE today, and it's really, the workflow is pretty similar to what I understand is coming. So JCE itself, what we're going to talk about is how to create that custom baseline. We're going to start with auditing rules. So one thing that I like about this tool is that you can always start with a really simple compliance baseline. Let's start, so this is what I recommend, because in the case where we're talking about the auditing rules, which we'll see a little bit more of, is they don't really have any user impact. So we're just kind of doing the first important thing is like, oh, well, is the device actually logging things that we need and have things turned on so we can audit the device? So you can start with those, and kind of get used to the workflow of how do I create this baseline, how do I check for compliance, how do I remediate? And so that's what we're going to do today. And again, it's a fantastic starting point. And we're going to talk a little bit about uploading and deploying with Jamf Pro, how we create the smart groups and policies we need for that, and then also how compliance and remediation works. And this will be kind of just a quick overview. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. But there's definitely, you can check out Jamf's site, and they have way more detailed stuff in there about how to use Jamf Compliance Editor. But yeah, I find it pretty easy to use, and I definitely recommend checking it out. So when you first launch Jamf Compliance Editor, what's great about it, again, it uses all that CIS goodness and stuff from macOS Security Compliance Project, so you can choose one of the established benchmarks. So depending on your environment, if you're in a highly regulated environment that already has one of these benchmarks that is an absolute must, I mean, you could just pick one of those, and that makes things fairly easy. But today, we're just going to start with the CIS Level 1, which is kind of the baseline of baselines, at least how I understand it, and it's always a great place to start. So once you've picked that baseline, you have all 91 controls that are part of that baseline, but we're not going to want to start with all those. And I don't recommend it because, especially if you're going to be testing this in production, which no one ever does, right? But you want to start with something that's really simple, that's easy to test and validate, and just so you can get the workflow right. So once we've done that, what we can do is we can option click and you can disable all the rules. So we don't want all 91 controls right now because we want to get used to kind of this workflow. And you can then go over to the auditing section and then option click there and just have those selected. So we're just dealing with the auditing part. So once we have that, you can go through each rule and learn more about it. And this is another thing that I really love about Jamf Compliance Editor is it just is a really easy way to kind of just click through and like get to know. You want to get a little familiar with what you're rolling out because I don't think anyone wants to just take a bunch of scripts and config profiles and just push them out and see what happens. What's nice about this is that you can go through each rule line by line and really understand why it exists, why this is a recommendation from CIS. So I really appreciate that part. But you can also learn what it's checking and how it remediates that finding. And just to compare the two, right, so you can get that benchmark PDF from CIS, and then you can see that the same stuff is really in Jamf Compliance Editor, courtesy of the macOS Security Compliance Project on the back end. So just wanted to give, again, a brief overview of kind of what happens. So we've picked the controls that we want in our auditing only baseline. And you can then create the guidance. And what that does is, if you see on the bottom left there, it'll give you those awesome PDFs that you want. It'll also give you an Excel doc that actually will list out your baseline. So if you have someone that's just like, I just want to see what controls that you're pushing out, I don't need to have a whole PDF, boom, you can give them that Excel document. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that comes out of that. You also get all the config profiles,plists, and the most important thing, actually, which is at the top, is the compliance script that actually you're going to be using to check for compliance and then remediate. You can also run an audit locally. So the audit script you can run from the command line, but also you can kick it off through JCE, which is really cool. And in the end, there's also the Jamf Pro upload button, which will take what you have in your baseline and then push it up to Jamf. So it'll do the script. It'll do extension attributes, which actually you'll use to kind of track whether devices are compliant or not. And you can also it'll include config profiles. This particular, since we're just doing audit only, does not include configuration profiles because all that is configured through the compliance script itself. So we'll talk a little bit about smart groups. Again, we just have to, each iteration of the guidance is tied to a specific OS version. So you'll want to, once you create a baseline for, let's say, Sonoma, you would create a smart group for that. And then you also want to create a smart group, and this is kind of using the extension attributes I mentioned earlier, that'll actually target devices that have findings, that are shown up as not compliant. And then you also have your smart group of compliant devices, which is always my favorite because that's the number you want to see keep going up and up. And so that way you can keep track of everything. So we also, just a brief overview of how to create the audit policies, really simple. You're just creating a policy. Most people have a daily inventory update policy or something like that. You can add this to it, so it's going to run the compliance script on the device. And you can add the check parameter, so it'll actually essentially audit your device for compliance and log locally on the device whether or not it's compliant and which rules it failed on. So we're checking for compliance, but then we also need to be able to remediate compliance. And you can do that however you like. I mean, you can run it at every check-in or whatever your frequency is. But in this case, we're using the same script, which is nice, except we're just running the check and the fix parameter. So it's just going to be checking it and then also fixing it if it runs into the issue. And in this case, what's, again, the great about the auditing one, why I recommend getting started with it, is because it will just handle it all, through the script. So we've kind of gone through the JCE part in there, and Jamf Pro. And then we'll talk a little bit about your cybersecurity advocate again, and also how you communicate to get that secure environment. So collaborating with cybersecurity, one thing that I can't stress enough how important it is to just continue to have ongoing check-ins, right? So don't just have like the one talk once a year before a new version of macOS comes out. Is really try to just continue having that conversation, continue advocating, for your users, also so you can learn more about the risks in your environment, if there's anything else you need to do proactively. But then also, again, communicating that impact to your users. You might find that, yes, you had a baseline, you tested it out, it seemed great, but it's not working with a certain piece of software or a certain group of users, and having that understanding, at least letting someone know in cybersecurity that there is user impact is super important, because a lot of the times that stuff doesn't get bubbled up to them. The other piece I'll recommend is communication. It's just super important. I think we all want to create a good user experience. We all want to make people happy. But if you're not talking to your users, especially when you're rolling out security controls, things can get a little messy. So if you have this new compliance baseline you just built, especially one that has more controls that might impact how your users do their jobs, you want to really meet your users where they are. Don't just send out the one email from the communications email address, or post it internally on some blog that no one reads or something like that. Find out where they are. Is there a Slack community? Is there a specific group? Try to maybe schedule meetings or have office hours. Just do something to let people know that security changes are coming, and that you want to talk to them about it. I think it's also important to understand the impact. So if you're doing something like turning off AirDrop, are there alternatives? People need to sometimes transfer files among devices. Maybe they have multiple devices. Maybe they have mobile devices. Let them know that there are other options. So if you're, say you use something like that's managed by your organization, like OneDrive or Dropbox or something like that, let them know, hey, we understand that you might be using this feature we're turning off. Here's an alternative. And I think people really appreciate that you've taken the time to understand how they do their jobs and how they can still get their work done. So that way you end up being, instead of a blocker to someone's work, you can end up being maybe a speed bump, because that's ultimately what we want. Is we want, we have to strike that balance, and sometimes it ends up adding a little friction, but we aren't preventing anyone from doing their job. Just maybe making it a little more secure and a little harder sometimes. And also communicating risk. I think, I mentioned earlier that the CIS benchmarks, explain why those controls exist. I certainly have learned a lot reading those, and I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I just, and I had no idea why some of these controls made sense to be part of a compliance baseline. But sometimes communicating that stuff, and again, that's just kind of general guidance. You're not necessarily mentioning any specific security risks in your organization. They're kind of just like, hey, this is best practices because of this. And I have had times where I've shared that, the CIS kind of why and discussions, with people. It's also important to anticipate pushback. You're adding friction at some point, with your users, and people aren't going to like it. But just have your ear to the ground. Show people that you're willing to listen, that you want to hear from them, and that you are doing your job as a Mac or Jamf admin, and are just trying to secure your devices. So. Hopefully a lot of people understand that you're just it's about meeting halfway in terms of productivity and also security. Yeah, just to recap, we talked about the CIS NIST frameworks, macOS Security Compliance Project, JCE, and also the cybersecurity collaboration and communication. But that is pretty much it. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully you learned something. And I have some time for questions, if anyone. Yeah, thank you.
In dealing with yearly security audits, have you found a lot of them to be very scattershot in their approach? Like one year I'll get asked about, how do you set the time? And one year I'll get asked about the screensaver timeout. And I'm not getting like the yearly, like, here is the list of all the things that we'd like to look at that I would sort of expect from like an in-depth security audit.
Yeah, while I can't speak specifically for what I've encountered, at Liberty, I can say that the more I've learned about CIS, the more I've learned about where these approaches come from, and I have found that it's that some of it seems to be, at least how I interpret it, is just that kind of lack of knowledge of macOS, and so it's kind of I've found that the more you learn about where a lot of this guidance comes from, the easier it is to understand where auditors might be coming from, if that makes sense. So it's kind of it's kind of that, like the more you understand about that CIS guidance and where those benchmarks are, the easier it is to kind of maybe decode and make a little more sense of that approach. So hopefully that's helpful. But yeah, because it gets to a point where it starts to make a little more sense the more you learn about auditing and everything like that. Yeah. Any other questions?
So my thing that we find is that when working with your cybersecurity advocate, it's hard to convey what is an actual risk versus checking a box. So do you have any good strategies when working with them for being like, yes, we understand that this is labeled as a risk, and we can understand why it could be considered posed as a risk, but the friction that it adds to either support or the end user outweighs that risk for if there was an actual like breach, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have found that typically my concerns aren't held to the same standards of actual people's concerns. That are people that are like, so you can say, hey, if we do this, people are going to be upset and not be able to do their jobs. And okay, sure, like maybe you don't get the response you want to that. However, sometimes rolling things out to a pilot group and getting that feedback and being able to share and say, hey, like we did what you asked, we checked that box, and this person can't do their work anymore. Let's have a meeting with them, or like, and then that kind of gives things a chance to get bubbled up maybe, because as we all know that once the right person is aware that their team of highly paid engineers can't do X, Y, or Z, then things start to change a little bit. So I think getting controls out there, having people test them out, and getting that feedback before you roll it out across the environment can sometimes move the needle a bit, not always, but I just find that actual user feedback tends to mean more than my feedback. So that's how I've approached things.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Last question will come from me as we're running out of time. Where can people find you either here or after JNUC if they have more questions or want to talk more about this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll float around for a little bit, but I'm definitely on LinkedIn. If anyone, Andy McPherson, Liberty Mutual, definitely look me up there, and I'd love to connect. So love talking about this topic or anything else that you're dealing with in your organization. So always happy to talk Mac stuff. So.
Cool. Thanks, Andy. Let's
yeah,
give it up
thank
for
you all
Andy
so
one more
much.
time.
Appreciate it.